Welcome to the Overanalyzers. I'm Dan. I'm a concept artist and illustrator.
And I'm Mike. I'm a software engineer.
We are a weekly podcast, and this week we'll be talking about memory. And before I forget, like I did last week, we're going to take a shot and then we'll get started.
Makes all the
Cheers.
difference. All right, much better. Okay. This past week, you were streaming a bit, which is something we've both started to do.
Mm-hmm.
You're streaming your quest to learn to draw the entire human skeleton from memory. And I've been working on I've been playing StarCraft trying to get into the top 200 players. So, you were streaming and you were trying to draw the skull from memory. And you'd done it and you'd done an okay job. And then you got done and we were talking. And you were saying how you were getting a little bit frustrated because it felt like you draw the skeleton and you have these trouble spots, around the between the eyes. You can't quite remember how that looks. And there's other things that you kind of forget. And so you go, okay, gotta remember this for next time. And then the week later you draw it and you have the same problems again. We were having this conversation and I thought, yeah, me too. Exactly that. Like I play the game StarCraft that I'm working on, and I'll play out a game. I'll go to review it and go, I should have done this when this happened. Okay, next time I gotta do this. And then I play more games, and the same thing happens again, and I just make the same mistake again, over and over and over. And there's been stuff like that I've done for years. I can still think like, oh yeah, gotta remember to make an overlord at 27 supply, and I just forget over and over. And I've seen other people do this too. They just make the same mistakes every single game. And it feels as if your mind is a palace or your memory is a palace, it's like you're in a room and you have a pot and you put it on a table. And you're like, okay, this pot, it's going to go on this table. Here's where it is. And then you walk into the other room. Then you come back and the pot's gone. Or it moved and it's on the bed. Or it morphed into a toaster. Something went wrong with the pot. And you're like, what the hell happened? So you take the pot, you put it back in the table, and you're like, stay there. And then you leave and you come back, and again, and just over and over, this pot keeps going somewhere else. And it's like the memory palace is haunted. And I remember being in school, and it's funny to frame it this way, but I remember being in school, and you'd have to learn something, like memorize the capitals of the US or the 50 US states. And your teacher would say, well, everybody just, repeat it. Say each one 50 times, do it 100 times. And it's like they're telling you to just take the pot and put it on the table, and then inevitably it falls off and you put it back on the table, and you just keep putting the pot back on the table over and over and over again, hoping that like this will eventually work. And I think that is not the way. We don't need to just keep putting the pot back on the table. We need to acknowledge that the place is haunted. We need a priest. We need to figure out what's going on. We need to weld the pot to the table where it stays forever. And that problem of living in this haunted memory palace, and I'll stop pushing this metaphor in a second, but we have to fix that, not just because we all want better memories, but because we're both trying to learn something, and this has become a serious problem. One of the biggest things that prevents you from progressing week to week is you figure out what you need to figure out. You do the problem solving, you do the practice of drawing, or for me, playing or whatever, and you identify the thing, and you say, okay, this is what this ought to be. And then you do the same thing again next week. It's like Groundhog Day. Except
No,
Bill
I
Murray
will.
does the same thing every time. Like it's inverted Groundhog Day. Anyway,
Well, I'll do a drawing and I'll run into issues and I'll get really frustrated about them. And I think, I just need to practice that or I need to look that up. But then later I'll flip through my sketchbook and turns out I already solved the problem multiple times. I already figured this out and yet I didn't remember it.
I've done exactly the same thing. I've taken notes on playing StarCraft, and I will open up. I'll find some old note from a year ago, and I have this. I don't know if other people get this too, but I have this feeling like the current version of me is the best version, and past me was dumb. Do you
Right.
ever? Okay, and
Yeah,
so
yeah,
I
yeah.
I find some old note, and I'm expecting to be like, ha, I remember me 2 years ago. I hardly knew a thing, and it's full of all the same stuff that I'm currently writing down and figuring out. Same thing. Like, oh yeah, I identified this problem years ago. I just forgot. Never fixed it.
Yeah. Oh, I was listening to this podcast and they're talking about. Of course, I don't remember it perfectly, which is stupid, but
I was so worried about that for this episode. I'm
yeah.
like, man, if we forget anything, people are gonna go, ha, charlatans.
Yeah, well, we should probably just come out and say that we're not, I don't know, we're not perfect models of people that can remember things perfectly, but
Right.
I have learned a lot just thinking about this. But I was listening to this podcast and he's talking about how you're just kind of, it got a little weird, but he's talking about how you're just this person sort of floating through time and your past self as you're taking notes should be as if you're leaving notes for future you, and then you right now you're writing notes for the future you, so you can find them in the future and open them up, and
Mm-hmm.
you're just this I don't know time machine moving through. I don't know. It was a cool thought that every note you write is just a note for you in the future, because you can't retain all of these things, or
Right.
we often don't, I guess.
Right. And as we get into this, I do want to talk about externalizing memory, like writing things down, because that's a big
Right.
part of this. And what should you externalize and what shouldn't you, and whatever. So we've both been working on this problem. I've been interested and cared a lot about memory for a while. You have only fairly recently, mostly because I've been pushing you to do it, but have started.
Well, yeah. So I've always struggled like normal people struggle, where I learn something, I work really hard, and then I just totally forget it, and
Right.
then I keep going back to it and relearning, and it's just I've just kind of come to accept that that's the way things are. That some people are really good at memorizing things, and some people are not good at memorizing things, and I'm one of those people. But
Right.
since you've been pushing it on me to start learning some actual methods of memorizing, it's been this whole new world of discoveries.
Yeah.
And so I've read a little bit in books and a little bit on the internet. I read about the whole memory palace thing, and actually tried it out. Of course, I have always heard about it,
Mm-hmm.
especially from Sherlock, and but I
Right.
just kind of figured it was what pretentious people call
Just
their
their way of
minds or something.
remembering
Yeah,
things. Yeah.
I just kind of wrote it off as you know pretentious losers or something. Just want to sound smart.
It's
But I
harsh, but
actually
okay.
looked it up. Well, yeah. So I actually looked it up and started learning about it. And I built my own, instead of a mind palace, I built my own mind office, which is this room behind me. And
Cool.
it was very easy to learn about. It took maybe 15 minutes or something. And now I have the whole room sectioned off in, I don't know, 15 different areas. And I memorize a lot of things this way now. I memorized an entire. Oh, I started just playing around with it
Mm-hmm.
and seeing what I could do. Whereas before, I could never remember the first two things on a grocery list, so I have to keep pulling it out every time I pick something up. I read about the memory palace thing, and then I would just read through the whole grocery list, memorize the entire thing, and then go to the grocery store, shop, and buy everything. And I was completely certain that I got everything.
Right.
And so it's been fun to start messing around with some of the methods. And
So
it's really opened my eyes to the fact that you can memorize things if you just think about them a little bit differently.
right. So real quick though, you're talking about the method of Loki, right?
Yes.
So just
Well, yeah,
explain
it's the
what
memory
that
palace is
is.
also called Loki, I guess.
I looked up how to pronounce that word, and the girl in the
Loki.
YouTube video said it's pronounced Loki or Loci or Loci or whatever. And I was like, okay,
Okay.
I'm gonna go with Loki. But what is that method? Because we wanted to talk about some of the different methods that you can use, and that's a big one. Like, how does that actually work?
Okay, well, I'll probably explain it bad, which is also anyway. But you choose a location, like a room or a scene somewhere that you are very familiar with. And stop me if I
No,
say something wrong, but you so for me I chose this office that I'm in very often, and you specify, I think it's 15 different areas, somewhere around there. And you specify them as specific locations. So I have the first third of my desk, second third, third third of my desk, and then I have three shelves in my left closet, and then the floor, and then I have my chair, and then I have another shelf with three closets, and then the floor, and then I have where my uh, easel is, and then I have my drawing desk, and then I have a little bookshelf over there, and so I have all these different uh, places in my memory office. And what you do when you well, all right. I guess I could just explain how I memorized a grocery list,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
do that.
Okay. So I had this list, and this was months ago. And the fact that I can hopefully remember it now
Well,
should be impressive.
you could lie if you really needed to. We don't know.
All right. So here's the list: bananas, eggs, blueberries, apples, English muffins, trash bags, chicken, toothpaste, ground beef, seltzer water, rice, potato chips, ice cream, two poblano peppers, spicy chili pepper, or spicy chili seasoning, random snacks, that was on the list, pita chips, hummus, and I can't forget to go to Sushi Storm afterwards to pick up my dinner. That was also on the list. All right, so the way I remembered all that, well, first it was just a giant list on my phone.
Yeah.
I looked at it, and you take each thing and relate it to a specific area in your memory office or memory palace. So on the top shelf of my closet, I had bananas that were shaped uh, um, like the spatula. Shaped like spatulas that were flipping eggs. So bananas, eggs, and I flipped a egg out of the frying pan. It fell on the floor into a bucket of blueberries, and the blueberries went scattering everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And the blueberries turned into apple trees. And I grabbed in, oh, I forgot Atkins bars, I think, when I said it. But anyway, apples, Atkins bars, and then English muffins. But
Okay.
the blueberries turned into apple trees. I would grab an apple off of the apple tree right over there. And then I would walk over to the Atkins bar, which was, that was kind of a pun, but it was on top of my chair over there. And then there was an English girl as the bartender. And I thought to myself, oh, she has nice muffins. And she heard me think that. And suddenly I felt very trashy for thinking that out loud. And those were the trash bags. And so I became a chicken. But I gathered up all my courage and brushed my teeth and then went to go talk to her again. But she hated me. So she turned me into ground beef and then poured acid on me, which turned into seltzer water, poured all over the floor. And then it evaporated and beat it up into rice. And then a giant steamroller came through my door, smashed all the rice, turned into potato chips. I scooped up the potato chips, sat down with a bucket of ice cream, and started watching a show hosted by two poblano peppers. And the show was on a spicy chili cook-off. And then, that's the spicy chili. And then all that talk of the spicy stuff made me really hungry. So I went to my random snacks generator and I pressed the button and a giant pita chip appeared in a bucket of hummus. And then as soon as I reached for it, I heard the crack of lightning outside, and that was the Sushi Storm. And that's how I remembered to go to Sushi Storm afterwards and pick up my dinner.
Okay.
So that was really long, but
beautifully done. That was
associating
extremely
ridiculous
memorable.
things all together in yeah. All right. It's
All right.
your turn to talk.
No. That was amazing. There was a lot of jokes in there. It was really told a tale. Well done. So you're talking about a few different things, and well, we'll get into some of the different things. But the method of Loki is what you said, this way of identifying certain locations in a physical space that you're very familiar with. It could be your house, it could be your friend's house, your childhood home, it could even be something in a video game or anything. But you have the capacity to have a good memory for physical spaces. And so you take these items that by themselves are pretty much lacking any kind of context. A bunch of bananas is just a bunch of bananas, but you put them in a physical location mentally, and you do something with them. You create an action, you create something ridiculous is actually better, because while you're I mean, I'm laughing and enjoying this tale of yours, but it's memorable, right? If you just
Yeah.
had read off a list of things, your mind has nowhere to put them. They're just these kind of contextless little bits of information that don't stick anywhere. But by putting them in a physical location and then creating these very vivid images, and in particular things that link from one thing to another. You know, you have the bananas and they're shaped like a spatula, and the spatula flips an egg, and the egg falls off, and it goes into the bucket of blueberries. And like, I can even remember this stuff just from you saying
Right.
it,
Yeah.
right? Like those are vivid and they're linked. It's a memorable action leading to another thing, right? So that's a fantastic example of the way your mind actually does work. We, I think, picture the way we store information a little bit like a computer hard drive, where a computer writes a bit of information to a physical disk or a solid state disk, and then later it goes and reads back that information. And you would think, in the computer idea, for a computer, the less information you store, the better in a way, right? Like you don't want the hard drive to fill up. If you just need to
Right.
store one word or one little idea, you stick it there, and that's where it stays. But your mind doesn't work that way, and it's important to not think of it that way. You do not have the ability to scan your hard drive in a sense. You can't just say, hey, tell me every single fact that you know. Start on the left side of your brain and go to the right, and just bleh, all of it. Like
Right.
you can't. The way your mind hangs on to things is by linking them with other things, and the more detail around it, the better. If you just think dozen eggs, that's not much. But if you create an image with those eggs and imagine them exploding or splattering and running down your wall, like it creates all these different feelings and ideas and even smells and senses that makes a much stronger, more memorable thing in your brain. And then your brain is not, again, it's not wired to just scan things down. It links things. It goes from one thing to another. And if you can link the image of the eggs to the blueberries, then that lets you move from one to the next. And the example you gave is a pretty fantastic example of the way you can present things to your mind in a way that it will remember them.
Do you know or have theories on why that is? Why is it that when everything's related, we're able to remember it? Because I have some ideas as to why, but I want to
I
know.
This is probably getting outside of what I have any authority to speak on. Not that we have any authority to speak on any of this stuff, but even more than normal.
We don't need authority to speak. We're just going to speak.
Right. Yeah, it's our show. We do what we want. No, the way I see it, your brain takes in an insane amount of information constantly. As you walk through life, every sound, every feeling, the sensations on your body, what you see, I mean, it's this tremendous torrent of information that is passing through your mind constantly. And your brain is designed to not attempt to hold on to all of that. I'm not sure what the implications would be if it actually recorded every single detail and bit of information coming into your mind, but I imagine it would be complete overload where your brain just cannot rewire itself fast enough to keep up with that. So your brain is set up to where by default it just discards information for the most part, and it hangs on to things that it deems are important. And if you think in like a caveman type scenario where most of the time you're just walking around doing whatever, and then holy crap, a bear in the woods, I gotta run, like remembering that, oh, those things are bad and I gotta get away from it is very, very important to your survival. And so your mind is pretty wired to take those vivid sounds and images and hang on to that. And that's kind of my way of looking at it.
Okay, because what I was thinking about is that one of our biggest ways of surviving as primitive humans was to go out and find the food and remember where it is and remember how to get home safely.
Mm.
And if you go through the woods for, I mean, you could walk for, I don't know, 10, 20 miles or something. And if you were used to it, you could find your way back just based on, and without even paying attention really, but you could find your way back remembering things like, oh, we turned left at the red tree, or we turned right at the small pond with the big rock in it, or we went straight for another 2 miles at the broken oak tree or something like that. Like you pick up unique characteristics in these scenarios and you're able to navigate through extremely complex things like that. So if you can't go find the food or you can't find your way back home, you're just dead. So it's extremely important as a human to be able to do that. And I think that's why we're so wired to remember connections with things, or that's why it's so important to put it in an exact location. Your
Hmm.
memory palace or Loki, like that tactic at least is so. I think it's derived from that need.
That's interesting. I haven't thought of the method of Loki part. I actually, for most of the things that I've done, I haven't used the method of Loki a whole lot. Some for sure, but
So I
uh,
think there's a lot of different methods, and each
yeah.
one kind of utilizes different tools that the brain has for memory.
So
But
okay, so here's the problem for me, because this isn't new to me. I've encountered this stuff actually really pretty young. I think Dad gave me a book called The Memory Book that I read, and it had a really old book, but it had all these ideas in it, or at least most of them, and how it used the grocery list example, and oh, here's this amazing thing you can memorize your grocery list, and you never need to write it down again. And the problem for me is that I went through the same thing. I got really excited at first and thought, cool, I never need to write down a grocery list again. But after a few times, you're like,
who
I've never
cares?
that upset about having to write down a grocery list. It it almost feels. think this I think this was an X-Men movie or something, but there's some scene where they're in the recruiting center with all the kids who have mutant powers, and they're going through them, and most of them have these stupid powers, like, oh, this guy can make his hair grow really fast, and this guy can fall asleep on command, and like most of the powers were just kind of dumb. That's kind of how I felt about the memory stuff. Was that
Right.
I'm using it, and it's really cool that I can memorize a grocery list and I can remember a phone number, but we have pen and paper, we have ways of writing things down. It felt kind of like novelty to me after a while, after the initial excitement
Right.
kind of
Well, I
wore
would
off.
a couple, I don't know, maybe it was a month or two ago or something, but you were talking about how memory is a solved problem. And you were like, preaching it pretty hard as,
Yeah.
we have memory figured out. But then later I'm like, okay, like people can memorize playing cards. Who cares? People
Right.
can memorize grocery lists. Who cares? Like, what about memorizing things visually? What about memorizing, things that are actually important? How do you
Right.
do that? Have we solved that?
Right. And that might have been a little bit of hyperbole, so sorry for that, but uh same thing for me. That I went through a bit of a cycle, and I bet a lot of people have had kind of similar feelings. It's likely that at some point most people have encountered this, oh, learn this memory trick or some mnemonic
Right.
device, and gone cool, and then not gonna use it. uh I same, yeah, same issue for me. Those things feel novel. I've learned these techniques, you can memorize a bunch of numbers, but then when it comes down to actually doing a thing, whatever it is, memorizing a piece of music to play on guitar, how does that fit? I mean, are you supposed to put every note on a shelf in your room? Are you, how does the method of Loki apply there? How does the
Right. Right.
major, like, how does stuff fit into that? And in most cases, when you actually get down to it, it feels a lot messier. There's a lot more little details that don't really fit into a flashcard. They're not some simple isolated fact that you can just remember. It's this whole network of things, and that's where it gets to be a lot harder. So for a bit here, I want to talk about how do these things actually apply to you drawing a human skeleton? How does it apply to me playing a competitive video game or playing guitar or something
Right.
like that?
Right.
Yeah.
So is that a question? I can try to answer it if it's
Yeah,
is that
let's
what
end
your
that in
question.
a question mark. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, you started telling me about this basically a flashcard system for your StarCraft playing, where you every time you run into a problem or a question or something you want to know in the game, you write it out as a question and then you have an answer to it. And you treat that, what is the system called? Anki, right?
So Okay,
I don't know if is that a brand or actually the method of.
so let me explain that real quick because this is a
Okay.
really key part of the different techniques and things. There's this, I don't know if it's a theory, just observation, whatever. They call it the forgetting curve. And this is measurable. If you taught somebody 100 facts, they within an hour they would forget many of them. Within a couple days they would have forgotten half, and a few days after that they would have forgotten 75%. The stuff that stays in your head declines very quickly. It's like a logarithmic approach to zero, where it
Mhm.
drops off and then you retain a few things for a while, whatever. Or another way of looking at that is if I told you a fact, I ate an apple this morning, your odds of remembering that in 10 minutes are pretty good. Your odds of remembering that in a day go down quite a bit. You're very likely to forget it, and so on. But if you're forced to recall that information just before you're about to forget it, so if in 10 minutes this is, hey, what did I have yesterday on April the 7th or whatever for breakfast? Oh yeah, an apple. And then if I asked you a day later, right before you were about to forget it again, hey, what did I have for breakfast on that day? You go, oh yeah, an apple. Like you're almost at the point of forgetting, but you remember it. You recall it out of your brain. Then you're likely to remember it for another 3 days. And after 3 days, you could say, hey, what did I have for breakfast? You recall it again, and then ask you again in 7 days. Basically, if you're forced to recall information just as you're about to forget it, you're very likely to remember it for a longer time span the next time, like exponentially longer. And
Right.
you can use this strategy of taking information and being forced to recall it and remember this fact. And if you do it correctly along this curve where you remember it in a day, remember it in 3 days, remember it in a week, remember it in 30 days, you can wind up very, very efficiently retaining this information over the long term. And this is, to me, this is a layer that is very, very important. And it kind of works on top of or alongside some of the other systems. You can remember your grocery list by using the method of Loki, but you still will forget it given enough time unless you
No, I
recall it
I
at the
had
right
it
times.
remembered really well for maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and then I just didn't think about it for about two
Right.
weeks, and then I was like, oh, it'd be cool if I could remember it. And there were gray spots, and I really had to think about it. And
Right.
there was a book I was reading, Spark, I think, and I don't. He's talking about the brain and everything, and he keeps mentioning SSRIs, and I realized I didn't really know what that meant. And so, I learned selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. That's what that actually means. And I knew that just thinking that I wouldn't be able to remember it. So I came up with, I pictured Sarah standing in the grocery store and she was real selective about her groceries, but she couldn't choose. And so there was this giant gust of wind that blew her up, but actually there was this chain that chained her down. And so there was this inhibitor,
Yeah.
inhibiting
Yeah.
her from the
Yeah.
reuptake, whatever. And so that was a very clear way for me to remember that. But, and I knew it really, really well for the 2 weeks that I was reading the book. But after not thinking about it for a month or so, it was gone. I was like, wait, I knew SSRIs. I knew
Hmm.
I knew what that meant. Why can't I remember? And it's just the fall off. It was gone, and I had to totally rediscover what that was.
Right.
So
Okay. So two things here. One, and I want to finish answering this question problem. Like we said, when it comes to actually doing something, if you're memorizing isolated facts, then all these memory techniques that you can learn, and there's a bajillion YouTube videos on and whatever,
hmm
you can go learn that and you can apply it to these isolated facts, and it will help you tremendously in remembering the capital of a state and so on. But when you're doing a real thing that's not so straightforward and isolated, I don't mean that isn't a real thing, but
a
you know what
real
I mean?
thing.
Something
Yeah.
that most of the memory stuff comes from memory sport, right?
Right. Right.
There's
It's a parlor trick. Yeah.
It kind of is, yeah. I mean, you can use it for things, but we don't need anyone to memorize 10,000 digits of pi. Like, that's not,
Right.
we weren't just waiting for somebody to figure that out for us. We can just figure it out with a computer. Uh, when it comes to something that's not so straightforward and not quite as contrived to fit with the memory stuff, it's much different. And I've noticed this with, well, okay, let's say a physical location. I gave this example last week about how you drive from your house to a friend's house and it's, maybe you can remember, maybe you don't. I live in a neighborhood that is absurdly, comically hard to navigate. The way it is laid out is just it's like somebody drew this really cool geometric design of circles and squares and triangles and all these roads that just arc everywhere. And when you're actually here, you're like, oh my God, this is insane. No matter where you are in the neighborhood, you don't know where you are in the neighborhood. It's amazing. So I have had so much trouble navigating because it's nothing clicks. There's no squares. There's no right angles. It's all super weird. But a little bit of trying to apply some of this memory stuff, I said, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some of these techniques to identify very particular locations. There's a church, and I'm going to remember the church, and I'm going to picture the church bells exploding and falling onto the street. And I don't want to give too many street names.
Why'd you have to
'cause,
blow up a church?
well, just the bell.
Okay.
Sorry. I'm able to create this very strong image of this church being on this street in this place, and I have that. It's a bit of an anchor. And then once I've identified a few of these points where at first it's as if my mind just cannot hang on to the neighborhood. Nothing fits, nothing goes with anything else. But by forcing myself to use these tricks of identifying certain spots, suddenly a lot of other things start to fit in. And I don't necessarily need some weird, contrived technique of, oh, I'm going to picture this thing and that thing. I know where the church is. And because of that, when I walk past the house that has the dog that always stands on the porch and barks at me, I remember, oh, that's the house right in front of the church. And then to the left of the house with the dog that always barks at me, there's this guy who has this big pile of mulch in his front yard and has never moved it. Like, oh, that's the guy with the mulch. And like stuff, I don't need tricks for that. It's like my mind has a little bit of a loose framework and things start to fit in with this framework by me creating these little islands of something solid that I can hang on to. And that to me is the closest thing that I can describe to what typically happens for me in a skill. So like with StarCraft, I'll play the game and there'll be certain areas of the game where I'm just lost. I just don't know what's happening. I don't, the opponent does something, I never quite know what it means. But by finding these very isolated parts of, I'm going to learn exactly how long it takes for them to build this building. And that will decide at exactly what point in the game they can get out this unit. And once I have these little islands of information that I have to use these tricks for, where I write it down and I set up the flashcard system. Oh, we need to come back to the Anki thing in a second, so I will. But I set up the flashcard system and say, I want to remember how long this building takes to build. I want to remember what point in the game they have enough money to start building the building. I memorize those hard facts just using those tricks because I have no other way of hanging on to it. But once they're there and other little bits of information start to show up, I have a way of fitting that in. I can go, oh yeah, well, of course it takes this unit 20 seconds to build because I know that their tech building finishes at this point and I know that they like to attack 20 seconds later. So of course it's 20 seconds. And like everything starts to relate and fit together. And I don't need little tricks for that. I just need these tricks to build these little anchor points or islands. And there's all kinds of stuff that fits in there too that's not nearly as literal or easy to spell out, like tiny little movements or things you see in the game, little patterns, knowing how to move your army in just these subtle ways. All that stuff fits and it starts to stick in your brain once you have these big anchor points of, oh, I know that this is my objective. I'm trying to hit their army at this certain point from two different angles. And then I can start to, as I'm playing the game, these tiny little things fit in of, oh, I should move this way, I should move that way, I should do this and that.
Right. But knowing those original methods of, like the memory palace or Loki or whatever, that ridiculous things are memorable.
Right.
That putting things in exact locations is memorable. That connecting certain issues with, I don't know, whatever it is, that certain things work for you in order to remember them. And so that's why I think those methods are really useful.
I think they're super key. I mean, none of that works like with the neighborhood. I could not remember where the church is or even that there was a church or anything. I had to use I don't know what to call it, like an outside method. I had to create this fake image in my head to trick my brain into hanging on to it. But my brain is pretty happy to fit in little details once it has more of an anchor point. And once I know the
Right.
church is there, then my brain doesn't struggle so much to fit in the house with the dog that barks at me when I walk by. So that to me is the way you use that kind of stuff. It feels
Right.
very parlor tricky, but if you understand some of the underpinning methods of being able to trick your brain into remember something or into remembering something, then you can abuse that to create these little things, and you can start to get this. It's almost like your brain is this three-dimensional spider web. It's not a hard drive where stuff just gets written down. It's this intricate
Right.
web, kind of literally. I mean, it's, three-dimensional neurons and stuff. And if you
No,
get these points,
not kind of literally.
literally,
It is.
literally,
Yeah.
it's literally a three-dimensional web of stuff. But you can create these points where things start to fit and crystallize. And we'd talked a bit or mentioned how in learning things, there's these certain feelings that come up. And one of the feelings that I have started to notice, I call it the duck brain feeling, or how like I know it, how like water runs off a duck's back, and the duck doesn't even know or care, like that expression. That's what it
I've
feels like sometimes. Yeah, it's like water off a duck's back.
I've
That's a thing
never
that
heard
people
that,
say.
but okay.
Okay, well, water runs off a duck and the duck doesn't care. It's just very water resistant to the point where the duck doesn't even notice. The feeling is where I will see things, I will hear things, I'll hear somebody talking, and it's as if the information just doesn't stick at all. It's almost like white noise, or like Charlie Brown's mom going wah wah wah. Like it just doesn't mean anything. It's because I don't have anywhere to fit it. I get some little fact, and there's nowhere to put it. It doesn't relate to anything. It's totally isolated, and it just disappears. But if I have some of those anchor points, and I'm able to remember them, then suddenly the information fits. And if it fits, your mind, again, because it has connections, it can go, oh yeah, that's why this thing is here, and that's why this and that. Like it
Right.
all plugs into place. And so that's what you want. And the duck brain sensation is a good signal that you don't have those anchor points that you need. And that's what you have to do to fix that.
Right. All right. So talk about Anki and
Mm.
StarCraft,
All right.
because
So
I have my own art version of that. But
okay. So the forgetting curve is the underlying principle, how if you recall things at certain times, it can create this really strong memory. And one solution might be to just say, okay, I'm just gonna make a flashcard for every piece of information I wanna remember. And then every day you wake up and review the flashcards. And that obviously doesn't work because it doesn't scale. Day one you have 10 flashcards. By day 180 you've got 3,000, and you're gonna spend your entire day reviewing your flashcards. So it's not a sustainable, scalable way of keeping track of information. But if you used if you use spaced repetition, which is this idea that you review something and then you put it off by this exponentially increasing amount of time, then you wind up being able to sustain pretty much as you want. Because eventually everything gets into this state where you review it once a year. It's you can handle tons of information this way. So there's a few different systems. Anki is probably the oldest that I know of and the most accessible and famous, but you can just go to, I think it's Anki.com or maybe Anki.web or something, but just Google it and it comes up. Anki's a flashcard system. It's free. It runs on different platforms, and it does this for you, where it lets you create a flashcard where you put in a question, and the question forces you to recall a piece of information. You flip the card, and then you can decide if you got it right or not. And then based on how you did, it will put it off by this exponentially increasing amount of time. So I just set one up. I wound up writing my own program to do it, just because I wanted to. I felt like it, but you can go use Anki, and it works beautifully for
right.
that.
But get to you're playing StarCraft, right? And
Hmm.
you're dealing with so many different things. I know a lot of people probably don't know what StarCraft is, but think of it like chess, but it's got crazy aliens and
Sure.
whatever and magic stuff.
Right.
But it is similar to chess in some ways. But you're dealing with tons of different things. How does that relate to a very specific flashcard?
Right.
How do you turn
So
that into some flashcards?
so this is the other part of this question that I think is a little bit under explained or underappreciated. The parlor trick thing is it is what it is, and I think people run out of steam on it because it feels like a parlor trick. When it comes to actually like this, trying to address the problem of StarCraft, it's incredibly complicated. How do I turn those things into flashcards? It is a bit of an art form. And I started doing this thinking, I think this will really help me. And I've been progressing at it quite a bit. So somebody pointed this out on my stream last week that they've tried this kind of thing where they'll create questions and whatever, but it's very easy to wind up setting up a question for yourself or some fact that you want to remember, but it's like you get really good at remembering it in flashcard form, but not in actually doing something useful form. It's very different. So what I've started to recognize is that the way I think in the game is something will happen and that triggers a response from me. So if I'm playing a Protoss and they place a cannon or they place a pylon in at my natural base, I know that nobody knows what the hell I'm talking about. It doesn't matter. When this thing happens, I have a very short amount of time to respond. And so rather than write out a question and say, if the Protoss does a cannon rush strategy, what are the most important things to remember? I write a question as, if I see a pylon going up on my natural base, what's the very first thing I do? And then the answer is, well, put a drone on this side and that side and block potential cannon spots and blah, blah, blah. There's a bunch of different reactions and responses that need to happen. And that's how I think in the game. There's a trigger and then there's a response, and I'm trying to shape the response. I'm trying to make sure that when this trigger fires, I see the pylon, I respond in the way that I want to respond. And that becomes a question. You see this, what's the very first thing you think? Or what's the first two things that you think? And good.
Sorry. So I was hearing you talk about this because you were kind of explaining it to me. And I kept thinking, all right, this is super cool, but how can it possibly apply to drawing something?
Right.
Right? Like you're playing a game, I'm drawing something, how can it apply? But then I started hearing, I made you read some of your questions to me. And I started thinking, well, whenever I'm drawing, I'll get frustrated with something because I can't quite remember it or I can't figure it out or whatever. Normally, if I'm not thinking of the flashcards, normally I just get really frustrated and I think, I need to go practice that thing. Like I need to go practice this area or something. I need to go work really hard in this direction, in some kind of vague direction.
Right. Yeah.
But the way you were talking about it is specifically tailoring the questions on the flashcards to exactly what your brain is wondering in the game or while I'm drawing. So I started writing down questions. And well, there's a couple aspects here, a couple different parts to making a flashcard, because I also started doing the flashcard stuff.
Right.
But I'll review a drawing and circle areas where I had trouble. And then I think back, what was going through my brain when I had that trouble, and I have to turn whatever frustration I had into some sort of concrete, actionable item. And so I have to take that frustration and make it a direct question with an actual answer.
Right.
So that's one extremely important part about making a flashcard. So actually, I have mine here, and hopefully. Okay, so say I'm trying to draw the eye socket of a skull, and I get real confused on say the angles of the orbit of the eye. And I'm like, instead of just getting really frustrated, I have to turn it into a question. So my question is, what is the angle of the? Oh no, that was the wrong one. How do you find all brow eye socket angles? And I have not answered that yet. So I have to go answer that and figure out a way to do it. But okay, here's one. How do you find the angle of the cranium center line? And I was having a lot of trouble finding the cranium or being able to draw the cranium, and it was driving me crazy. But if you find the center line of it and how it's angled and everything, you can actually figure out how to draw it. So I had to come up with this question, which was really hard to do. How do you find the angle of the cranium center line? And then the answer is you use the triangle method and or a side view grid in perspective. And so every time I have trouble with that same thing. Like, oh God, how do I do the cranium? Well, I know the answer. I use this triangle method where you find the
Mm-hmm.
chin, the top of the forehead, and the back of the skull, and then you put that in perspective, and that back line is the angle of the cranium or a part of it. Or I can draw a side view and put that into perspective, and how I find it. So this very simple. Uh, Wait a minute, how do you do this thing? Oh, these are a few methods of how you do that thing. And so I your I don't know, your discovery of phrasing these questions as the exact same way that you encounter the problems
Mm-hmm.
was very eye-opening to me. And that's how I've been able to apply it to art. Say if you're playing music, you do the same things. Whatever frustrations that start happening, if you can turn those into concrete questions,
Right.
then you can come up with solutions to them. And you can use whatever memory methods you want to memorize those solutions to the same questions. But
Right. Yeah, to me that's your objective. The thing you're trying to do is create a representation physically, like on a flashcard, of the way your mind is thinking, and then you use whatever technique you have available to you to try and make that work. If you want to use the method of Loki and that's applicable to what you're doing, you do that. If you Well, we should mention this. Numbers are really hard, right? Because a number has no physical
right.
manifestation. There's no meaning around it. It's just this very abstract, hard to hang on to thing. And if you want to learn numbers, which I've had to do for StarCraft, right? Like I've realized that learning the build times of lots of things has been really, really beneficial for tons of reasons. And I've been using the major system, which you can go look up. It's on Wikipedia or whatever. You basically just take each number or each digit 0 through 9 and associate with a sound. So the number 3 makes an M sound, the number 2 makes an N sound, number 1 makes a T or a D sound, and stuff like that. And then any given set of numbers, like 36, you can essentially pronounce them. The 3 makes an M, the 6 makes the CH sound, and you can insert
Right.
whatever vowels you need to. So for me, I picture 36 as a mochi ball, those little ice cream mochi ball things. Uh,
Yeah.
and so I have this image in my head that's far easier to hang on to, and I can create this thing that I can remember. And so as I'm setting up flashcards and trying to do this, use whatever methods. If you have a ton of numbers you need to memorize, I don't know, you're a mathematician or you're in some kind of you're pursuing something that requires a lot of numbers, then there's more powerful systems than the major system. There's something called the Dominic system, which I may have mentioned before, where you associate like pairs of numbers with a person and an action and things like that. Anyway, point is, go use whatever method you want. Method of Loki's out there. Just in general, creating vivid imagery and linking them together. The major system for numbers, the Dominic system for lots of numbers, stuff like that.
Right.
But the goal, and I think this is what I felt was missing from a lot of the what I read on the memories, that memorizing things in a vacuum is not always that useful. That what you just said, that's what you're trying to do, is you're trying to figure out the way your mind is approaching something, what actually needs to happen in your head, and then represent that in the best way you're able to. Create these very concrete, actionable question type of things. Use whatever memory technique you need. And part
Right.
of the value of that process is just forcing yourself to think about it. If you realize, wait, how do I find the center line of a cranium? And I actually
Right.
don't really know, then
No,
there you go. That's a problem. You don't know.
I think that's actually been one of the most important parts of this whole thing is that you're forced to take some weird, vague frustration or
Right.
problem that you're having and turn it into something concrete that you can solve. And
Right.
look, this is all, I have 3 folders of these, but I don't know if you can see them.
Okay.
Okay. These are all the ones I haven't answered. And this is just from trying to draw a skull. Right?
Yeah.
Well, they all have writing on them. But these are just the ones I haven't answered. And then I got a whole folder full of easy ones and then a folder full of hard ones.
Yeah.
And I mean, at first it's just, oh God, I don't know how to do this. Like, this is really hard. But then I sat down and started analyzing, what went wrong when I did it.
Mm-hmm.
And I just keep making card after card after card. And, if someone asked on my stream, well, how does flashcards apply to music or writing a song? Well, try to write a song and then if it doesn't go well,
Yeah.
analyze why that didn't go well. Where did you start running into trouble? And that might be broken down into 30 different questions. But if you can break those down into concrete questions, you can answer them.
Right.
And then once you answer them, if you memorize the solution to them,
Right.
you're good. You're done.
Yeah. And even just the act of formulating a question is a huge part of it. The other thing I wanted to mention is that, and I've discovered this as I'm iterating on this process and, trying to make it more useful, but you don't need to capture everything. The goal is not that you can represent every single detail you would need to draw a human skull in flashcard form, because I don't think you could even
Right,
do
right.
that, right? It's, the detail is more
Well,
abstract and three-dimensional.
I'm looking for questions that trigger a visual
Exactly.
response. Yeah.
Right. And you're, once you establish, like you said, you're trying to establish those anchor points to where other things begin to just slot in. If
Right.
you can remember this trouble spot on the skull, and okay, I know how this part goes, then suddenly you're past that, and now the next thing, it fits. Your mind is able to more easily slot it into, yeah, this is what this looks like, and you don't need a flashcard for every single thing or to have to turn that into a question. And same thing with StarCraft. If I can establish the basic, here's what I should be thinking, here's my response to this thing, then
Right.
every different game I play, there's always subtle differences, there's always little things that happen and things I start to learn. But if I have that, then those little details have a place to fit. I can remember those without some special trick or flashcard, because they fit in my brain to this structure that's already there.
Right.
And one thing I wanted to think about a little bit, Wesley Rayleigh commented a week or so ago about how he was not necessarily looking to push some physical skill like playing guitar, but he started to get it with this journey we've been on of talking about getting good at stuff. He was saying how, oh, you know what, actually there are certain things that I would like to get good at, like conflict resolution and team building and some social skills and things like that. And I was thinking about that and thinking, wow, that seems so different compared to drawing a skull or playing StarCraft or playing guitar. But obviously it is very different, and there's a lot of things that go on that maybe don't show up everywhere. But memory, I am positive, is a huge part of that. And I think the techniques that you would use for that would not maybe even be that different. Just on a really basic level, if you think about a
Right.
salesman, or not even a salesman, but anybody who is, their job, or they're trying to be very good at maintaining a relationship with a client and making sure they're happy. It could be simple as a hairdresser or anything. One of the things that makes them very good at that is their just memory of basic facts about their client. If they remember their name, remember their kids' names, remember what they talked about last time, remember, oh, you said this and you were thinking about that. Like, that is one of the simplest ways of making somebody like you, or making them feel valued, is that you just
Right.
remember what you talked about. And there's a million things that are much more subtle than that. If you were trying to work on your uh, say conflict resolution skills, you might have some encounter where there is a conflict and you're trying to get a big part of what you're doing is trying to create a certain feeling in someone else, that they're being heard and understood, and not brushed aside. And you might have this encounter and then have to reflect back and go, wow, I said this thing and they didn't quite react right, and I think that I ought to do this next time. And I don't know if you're building a literal flashcard for that or not, but you might be. But if nothing else, you're creating this thing of, this thing happened, I had this trigger, and I want to react this way next time, or I think this is the better way to do it. And the memory aspects become hugely important. And same thing, you're not trying to memorize every possible detail of the way you interact with somebody, but you are trying to create these anchor points of, when they do this, it's a signal that this is happening, and I want to respond this way, or I want to
Right.
respond with a redirection or something like that. And
Yeah.
I think that concept of getting deep into what you're doing and trying to identify the way your mind is approaching it, and finding these little points, and then creating these much more concrete, actionable questions and answers and facts, and remembering them. That's that's a huge part of how you develop almost any skill, I think.
Yeah. And it's made a huge difference in
Yeah.
what I'm trying to do. Just making these things concrete,
Hmm.
because you often think about them in such vague terms of, oh, I just need to work harder in this area, or oh, I'll remember this next time. I'll totally remember this next time.
The,
But it
yeah.
just doesn't work like that.
If you start paying attention to that, you can always get insight to this. But I'll watch other StarCraft streamers, and a lot of them are very learning focused and trying to do the same thing. And it's funny to watch that, where they'll say that like, oh, I forgot the 27 Overlord this game, and then the next a week later they're going, oh, I forgot the 27 Overlord in this game. I got to remember that. And a month
Right.
later, same deal. Like it that the haunted memory palace, which is a fun metaphor for me. That's such a thing. It's always going, like you're living in this haunted place where you keep putting something down and it keeps disappearing, and you got to fix that. You can't
Right.
you can't operate that way. Anything else you want to add? Should we?
Well, okay, there's one last thing.
Okay.
I read about this a little while ago, and I'll post a link to it. But there was a study done, I believe, by MIT, but they they set up these monkeys, and it was a very brief summary of this experiment, so I don't have a lot of details. But they set up these monkeys to watch, I don't know, a series of images, and for each image, you either had to look left or look right, and if you looked a certain way, you would get rewarded, and that was the correct way. And if you looked the other way, you wouldn't get any reward. And they're watching these monkey the brains of the monkeys and how they reacted to being correct or being wrong. Uh, Being right, all you get is a reward. Being wrong, you don't get anything.
Right.
And what they found was that when the monkey was correct, I don't know what was on the images, but when the monkey was correct and it got a reward, the brain basically woke up and started, neurons are firing all over the place, and it's remembering, it is
Mm-hmm.
remembering everything that it did. It's analyzing, what it did to get it right. Whereas when the monkey got it wrong, nothing happened. There was no change. There was nothing, which is extremely interesting because
Yes, it
as a
is.
society, we always say, oh, go make mistakes, go make 1,000 mistakes, and, go keep trying things, and eventually you'll just be really good at something. But no, you won't. You actually only learn when you do something the right way. Because if you think about all of the different ways something can be wrong, it's infinite. When in theory, and I know it's different for a lot of different things, but in theory, there's only one way to do something the correct way. But if you get it wrong, you've just eliminated one of the infinite possibilities of how not to do something, which is maybe in some cases it's beneficial, but in most it is not. If you get it the right way, you have learned. And I completely forget how I was trying to connect all of this, but what you want to go for is getting it right. And so those people streaming, they're like, "Oh, I need to remember to go look this up." They keep running into problems and they keep to go find the solution. Or they found the solution but they've never implemented it.
Right.
So they've never been rewarded for it being correct. And I found this when I was drawing, that every time I would run into a problem that I knew I had worked on, it was that I hadn't actually ever gotten it right. I've only kind of found the solution, sort of found a way that maybe I should use the solution, but I never actually did it. But once you get it right, your brain kind of wakes up and starts really remembering why you did that. And also with the monkeys, they were way more likely to get the next one right if they had gotten the one before it right.
That's
So success leads to more success. Failure leads to nothing. It doesn't. Nothing has changed, which I just thought was really interesting.
I feel like you're gonna get some people disagreeing with you, which is
Well, uh,
especially with what you said about how, just making mistakes is not a
okay.
good idea.
Well, let me clear it up. I You should never be afraid of making mistakes. Never be afraid of making mistakes. And when you make mistakes, it can be a learning experience because you know not to do that thing again. But what you should always be after, your intentions should always be success. You should always be full-heartedly going after the thing to do it the correct way. Do not carelessly just flail around and go,
Right.
"Oh, I'll just make mistakes here and over there and whatever, and eventually I'll be good," because you will never be good that way.
Right.
That's kind of what I mean.
The way I would think of that, that's really fascinating. I actually really like that, and it does line up with my experience very much. I think that in some sense, like with StarCraft, with like the cannon rush, sometimes what you might have to do to win that game requires 20 different things. They're going to do this and I got to respond correctly, and then this thing happens and I got to respond correctly, and so on and so forth. And the numbers 2 through 20 don't happen if you mess up number 1. Like, you have to get number 1 right, and now you have the next
Right.
thing, and now you have to do that, and there's this whole elaborate structure of things that have to happen that you have to learn and remember. But if you don't have the first one, if you just keep messing up thing number 1, you never get there. And I don't know if that's
Right.
exactly what you're saying, but it's at least similar. The way I would put it is that if you're doing something wrong, that's fine. Like, you did something wrong, and that's what's going to happen most of the time, especially at the start. But the value of doing something wrong is that it can help you, if you can recognize that it's wrong, it can help you find the right thing. But the quicker you can make the right thing happen, the better. I
Yes.
should not go 15 games of doing the same wrong thing before I get it right. The ideal case is that I get it wrong in game number 1, I do it right in game number 2. And then I start
Right.
filling in the details of what needs to happen. And I've noticed this too, like with the flashcard system and the way I've been approaching this. Sometimes you misidentify what you needed to do. I might realize, hey, actually, this isn't quite the right response to this thing. And that's totally fine. Like, that is also a part of the process where the things you identify, the questions you ask, the way you frame up the problem, that can be iterated on and changed at any point. But the important thing is, just being able to create that and identify this thing. Oh, this is what I want to do. And it's concrete. It's not this messy, vague thing anymore. That actually gives you a way of testing that. You can use it or do it, and then it makes it easy to evaluate. Oh, no, this isn't actually the best way to find the center line of the cranium or something or other.
Right.
Like, that's part of the process too. But, I guess what I'm saying is I agree. You got to find the right thing, and you got to make that happen. Remember it, get it into your brain and your memory as quickly as you can. And with all this memory techniques and everything, those are there to help you do that. And in some cases, they're super, super valuable. They're essential sometimes. Being able to create vivid imagery, getting your brain to hang on to something. Sometimes it just feels impossible to do that. Some number
Right.
you got to remember. Well, use a technique to remember the number, and that gives you this thing. But those are just tools. They're basic tools to help you
Right.
create, well, the mental model, the thing we've been talking about.
But they give you insight into how your brain remembers things, which
Yeah.
is what you should use when you're learning a skill or learning anything.
Right. Cool.
All right. I think we've gone pretty far over.
Yeah. And my dog is, I don't know if you can hear him, but he's
I
screaming
can
at
hear
me.
your dog.
He's
getting
either
me
going to
up.
eat dinner or he's going to eat me. So, all right. Well, thanks everybody for watching and listening. You welcome to leave comments. We love them. We are launching a Discord server, and we will put the link to
Yeah.
that in the description. If you want to talk to us and talk to each other and discuss some of these things, we are really excited to do that. If you're listening on a podcast platform, you can email us at theoveranalyzerspodcast@gmail.com. Otherwise, see you next week.